Welcome to the CEC Report. It's 22nd of March. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, without Glass-Steagall, Cyprus will happen here. Gillard and Rudd wrestle over the steering wheel of the Titanic. And finally, who's using chemical weapons in Syria? So first, without Glass-Steagall, Cyprus will happen here. Craig, this has become a very dramatic week and we're at a breaking point in the global financial crisis because what we've had is 4 years of bailout arrangements and the increasingly shaky bailout arrangements piled on top of increasingly shaky bailout arrangements. So, and the biggest element to it is money printing.
And more fascism to go along with this, Robbie, in terms of austerity. I think it's important for our new viewers they might be recalling, what's Glass-Steagall? What's this all about? Well, look, Glass-Steagall is a law, actually a principle that we're proposing and Lyndon LaRouche is proposing in the United States to enact laws to actually re-establish a sane banking system, to break up the mega banks that we have now, to create a regulated and protected commercial banking system which basically handles the everyday transactions, loans and so forth.
The real economy.
The real economy. And quarantine the merchant speculative side of things, which is the debt-laden side of the economy, right? So that's what we're proposing, laws to actually in Australia break up the big four banks and get rid of the stockbroking houses, get rid of insurance companies that are associated with them, get rid of all the fancy trading houses and so forth that they have, and just take them back to being regulated banks.
And that is a principle to protect depositors.
Yes,
right?
A real protection.
And what we've seen this week, sort of for the first time actually, is literally the opposite. A principle being proposed to make depositors pay for bailouts.
I think what's really freaked people out in Europe, Robbie, on this and around the world is that Merkel, Chancellor Merkel of Germany, made it a key point that under this system the depositors will be protected up to 100,000 euros. And yet, this very week, the same European Union, monetary union, intends to literally shave or take or steal 10% of depositors' funds in Cyprus to bail out the banking system. No wonder people are worried, because where would this end?
Yeah. Well, let's just go through it. Here's the point. The reason we're discussing this is this little country, Cyprus, little island really in the Mediterranean, could be the loose thread that unravels the entire global financial system. So you've got the Troika. In Europe, the Troika is the European Union, the European Central Bank and the IMF, and they're the ones that have been dictating these bailout arrangements. And Germany is very is quite closely intertwined with the Troika, because often what money does get put up comes from Germany. So they're the ones that are in a panic at what's happened with the state of the Cyprus banks. And the Cyprus banks are in trouble because of investments the banks have made outside of Cyprus, not because of the economy of Cyprus per se, but like they're exposed to the Greek economy and things like that, right? So, and they're worried that if those banks collapse, that could set off a chain reaction which unravels all these shaky bailout arrangements that are already shaky in Europe, right? So they're worried about that. So they said, hey, you've got to have this bailout. Here's the terms of the bailout. The people of Cyprus have to pay for it through these a 6.75% tax on deposits under 100,000, 10% tax on deposits over 100,000. Now, depositors are customers. They're not the owners of the banks. This is not the bondholders being made to pay. This is the customers. And of course, here's the problem. The solution is just as bad as the disease. The cure is just as bad as the disease, because left alone, these banks could bring down all of Europe. This solution risks a run on the banks, not just in Cyprus, because everyone in Spain, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Portugal, that the IMF has stepped in with dictated bailout arrangements, they'd be thinking, well, this is new, that depositors can be made to pay. We don't want to have all of a sudden have our money stolen here. Let's get it out. And the principle of banking, Craig, is quite simple. A bank can be perfectly solvent, but no bank survives a run on it.
No.
They never have all the money on hand to pay out depositors ever, right? That's not how banking works. So the so-called solution risks doing the same thing, risks the same collapse that they're trying to avoid. Now here's the thing. Out of principle, the government, the Parliament of Cyprus, across all the parties have united on this. They've said, no, we will not impose this conditionality. We're not going to steal this money. So they're back to square one. And as of today, they've had to extend the time that the banks will be closed to at least Tuesday next week. So they've been closed all week since last weekend, and now they're going to be extended to be closed till at least Tuesday next week. You can use the ATMs, but you cannot. But that's all. You can't transfer. You can use your FPOS card in a shop, but you cannot do interbank transfers or anything like that. And they're also looking at perhaps putting on capital controls. So the point is, we're at the beginning of this crisis, because the banks have said, the Parliament said, no, we're not going to do this stealing of deposits. We're at Plan A, and that means the Cyprus banks are still a risk to the European banks. And what we're saying, Craig, is if they're a risk to the European banks, then we're back to them being a risk to the whole system. Now, let's come a bit closer to home. What does this mean for Australia? Well, before we get to Australia, let's look at New Zealand. Because amazingly, now we reported here last week that our Reserve Bank has come out with a bailout fund for our banks.
Yeah, $380 billion.
$380 billion bailout fund. So they're planning a system that they can use to keep our banks propped up in case something goes wrong. Well, so is New Zealand. But New Zealand's is exactly like what Cyprus has just rejected. The Finance Minister of New Zealand, Bill English, is proposing a mechanism called Open Bank Resolution, under which if a New Zealand bank fails, the next morning all the depositors of that bank will find that they've had their deposits shaved by the amount needed to bail out that bank.
There's a real irony here, Robbie, because I mean, the government in this country, in Australia, has guaranteed deposits up to $250,000. However, the banks themselves say that they're not responsible for those deposits. So if they don't have the money, they're actually not liable to pay your money back. But the government, in order back in 2007, 2008, 2009, put this guarantee in here to stop the runs on the banks that was being caused by the global financial crisis. So the point I want to make is that it's a very, 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 very fine line between, having the confidence in the banking system and literally creating a run. And when only about 2 or 3% of the actual banking deposits is in the form of cash, in the form of money, you can see it does not take very much at all for the banks to literally run out of cash.
And when you have all this activity by governments, including our government, New Zealand's, etc., preparing for a crash, it must send the message at a certain point, hang on, is any confidence well-founded here, well-placed? Because it doesn't look like there should be confidence. And we're saying there shouldn't. And without Glass-Steagall, there shouldn't be.
And the Cyprus thing, right, the literally stealing of the money out of the so-called guaranteed $100,000 euro deposit, then would raise questions in Australia's mind, people in Australia who know about the deposit, and say, well, if the European government does this, and they're supposedly guaranteeing deposits, what's to say the Australian government doesn't do this, which is guaranteeing deposits for $250,000?
That's the point. It becomes the precedent.
Yeah.
Now, so what's the likelihood that Australia might find itself in this position? Well, the likelihood is, remember 2008, if Cyprus unravels the whole thing, and we go back to that chaos of 2008, well, Australia will be right in the middle of that chaos, but in a situation where we're in much more debt than 2008, right, as a nation, and the ability of the government to step in and do something is much more limited, and therefore what you're saying becomes a real risk, that our government, following the global precedent, all of a sudden depositors are being told, no, we're going to take your money. Now can I talk about a bit of good news?
Well, just a second, I want to say one other thing, Robbie, on this, because we have $1.4 trillion in superannuation deposits. There is nothing to say that our government can't pass legislation when it gets stuck to say we are going to demand that 10, 15 or 20% of those funds get transferred into government securities, therefore refreshing the government's coffers. So all these sorts of mechanisms come out of this idea of transgressing this idea that depositors' funds are sacrosanct. Because what the government is saying is that, no, they're not. We can do what we want. We can treat our people as if they're just sheep to be shorn. And that's the principle that's been transgressed here. So it goes across not just the depositors' funds, superannuation funds, the whole works.
Well, let's talk about Glass-Steagall. This week, the good news is that in Iceland, now Iceland's an interesting country because people might remember it was probably one of the first countries to get in trouble. It was the first sign of a global financial crisis. Iceland was like the iceberg that the Titanic hit, right? And the big issue with Iceland was it was British banks lost a lot of money, and the British banks expected austerity in Iceland to give them their money back, and the Iceland government had to make a decision: do we follow the dictates of the City of London, or do we not accept austerity and stand up for our people? And they were the first to say, no, we're not going to go that path. They haven't gone down the austerity path. What they've done, by and large, has worked. They've set a bit of an example for the world. They're still doing that. This week, the Iceland Parliament's Economics and Trade Committee has unanimously passed a motion for Glass-Steagall, right? And I'll just read part of the wording of it. Quote, the minister shall set up a committee to explore whether and in what way the separation shall be conducted in order to minimise the risk of the banking system to the economy of the nation. That's the key word, minimise the risk of the banking system to the economy of the nation. So that's passed the committee, and then that goes to the whole parliament. We'll have to go to the whole parliament to be voted on, etc. But the committee is recommending that. So let's think about this crisis, Craig, if we had Glass-Steagall, right? Because first of all, what we would know, right, is under Glass-Steagall, depositors would not be being shorn, they'd be being protected, right?
That's right. I mean, I think the message to be given to people here, or they should take away, is that Glass-Steagall protects the entire system. It separates out the legitimate and necessary banking system and protects it as a fundamental necessity for the economy, and all the rest of it, well, it can sink like the Titanic.
Well, so because by now, if the European Union had have gone with Glass-Steagall, the Cyprus banks would not have this terminal exposure to bad investments.
The entire system wouldn't be driven by debt, and the debt is unpayable. Therefore, you've got to do something about this. Instead of looting the population, you have to say, make a political decision. We are not going to loot our populations. We are going to protect our banking system. To the hell with the rest.
Yep. Very good. One last point, which we raised here before. Given how Cyprus has somewhat come out of the blue, there was a strong recommendation made by people in the United States on Glass-Steagall, because there's this little sense there's a bit of a lull in the financial crisis, and then Cyprus has just hit us. But this expert in America made the point, now you want to implement Glass-Steagall when there's a time of relative calm or stability.
Now.
Yeah. Don't wait for this crisis, because Cyprus shows you how quickly the crisis can erupt. It's much messier when you've got that on.
And Robbie, we have a petition now on our website. Australia needs a Glass-Steagall separation of banks. People should go on our website, download that petition and get it signed by as many people as possible and send it in to us. We'll lodge that with the Federal Parliament, House of Representatives, and you really stick it to them in order to be able to push this issue and get it passed now.
Yep. Okay. We've run out of time, Craig. When we come back, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but in the context of this leadership battle in Australian politics. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Gillard and Rudd wrestle over the steering wheel of the Titanic. So, Craig, it's Friday, the 22nd of March. Last night was the big non-event. But it's just politics is sort of tearing itself apart. However, this metaphor of the Titanic, the point is, when we talk about them wrestling over the steering wheel, we're not referring to the Labor Party. We're referring to the country as a whole. And this is something that people don't get. Now, I'll talk in a second about. I just came back from Canberra yesterday with a delegation from here, but we're the only political movement in this country that's consistently said that what defines everything is the global financial crisis, and we said it before anyone knew it was on, right? And sure. If you take you look at this last 6 years of politics, which has been quite extraordinary. We've had the toppling of a long-term Howard government, we've had the rise of Rudd, we've had the spectacular collapse and fall of Rudd, and then we've had this bitter division, and that culminated in yesterday. There's only one explanation for this kind of turmoil, and no one wants to look at it, except that everything is defined by the collapsing economy in Australia. See, and I'll give you some predicates. When Howard lost office to Rudd, right? no one acknowledged that the issue there was the economy. People vote with their back pockets, unfortunately, and there's the cost of living crisis had already started, and that's why people turned on Howard. The stupid media was saying things like, oh, people are tired of Howard. No. When there's no solutions coming from government, but when the new government came in, they weren't responding to the idea that, oh, there's an economic crisis to be averted here. They're talking, oh, everything's great. This is Australia, everything's great. So Rudd and Gillard, this Labor government, have never addressed the economic crisis. They were forced to respond to the GFC on an emergency basis, but they just did what the economists told them to do. But things like the emissions trading scheme and climate change, right? They had this great big huge plan for an emissions trading scheme and climate change. What derailed it was the economy. People stopped caring. They stopped being whipped up about global warming, the fraud of global warming, where that once upon a time in 2007, a lot of people thought that's the biggest issue, because the economy became the biggest issue, right? And we've still got this denial that, oh, okay, everything's all fine here. So we've got two political characters, Rudd and Gillard, who've been trying to stay alive politically in a crisis that they don't acknowledge exists, right? And that's the problem. So we're in Parliament this week. We're meeting members of Parliament on Glass-Steagall. That's why we were there. It was stunning what we found. Most members of Parliament have no idea what Glass-Steagall is, even though it's the biggest issue in Europe and the United States being debated. No, why would they need to know? Because our banks are fine. Everything's great here.
Well, that's what I was about to jump in and say, Robbie. Look, these Labor and Liberal Party are creations of the banks. The real government in this country is not those people up there in Canberra. They are simply the minions of the bankers, and this is the change that's taken place since the late 50s. Actually, since the death of Chifley. Chifley in the late 40s was wanting to nationalise the banks and bring the power of banking under the control of government for the benefit of the general welfare. Now, he got smashed in that process. Unfortunately, it didn't go any further, and since then you've basically had a banking monopoly govern Australia, and people have to really understand that that's the problem here. You've got two parties that are completely complicit to the whims of the private banking sector, the City of London.
And they're basically yes men. So they don't need to know these things.
They might be nice people and all, Robbie, but unless you understand who the enemy is, you're impotent.
Well, here's another example. One MP who was given his position, this was particularly stunning, did not know what derivatives were. Well, he was interested, he wanted to know, he's concerned now that we told him, but given his position he should have known.
And we were featured in 1994 in the Australian Financial Review, actually talking about the rise of derivatives, right, from the 90s, 91, 92 period, as a deadly instrument. Now, we were quoted back then as, and that sort of gives you some sense of the authority of where we stand as an organisation over the last 20 years.
Yeah, and this guy, Craig, said to us, I'm going to go and talk to Joe Hockey about this. And we had to point out, well, that's fine, but Joe Hockey's new chief advisor is the former managing director of UBS, Union Bank of Switzerland, who just admitted that their traders have been rigging our benchmark interest rate in Australia, right? So that's an example of what you just said. The bankers, they just do the bidding of the bankers. So we found that. However, we did find this. This is very important. Behind closed doors, not among the general members of Parliament, behind closed doors at the very highest levels, Glass-Steagall is already being discussed in Australia, because among people, the same people who are cooking up these plans for bank bailouts, etc., they know they've got to look at it. So anyway, in terms of the leadership side of things, Craig, and just the whole, that is a symptom of this. You're a leader of a party. What advice do you have for it?
Well, look, the issue is go back and look at history. Any leader that's worth his salt or her salt actually takes on the banking system.
Yep.
Whether it be Ted Theodore back in the 30s, Kurt Chifley during the war years and so forth. They take on the banks because the banks are private institutions that should not be in a position of dictating policy, public policy for the Australian people.
Or even Gorton and McEwen with the AIDC,
another
public funding mechanism.
So there's people go back and look at history. The real fight, the real politics is in taking on the banks and developing
on behalf of the people.
Developing the policies of national banking as we've talked about.
All right.
And that's basically where it starts.
All right, we've run out of time, but when we come back, we're going to talk about chemical weapons in Syria. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, who's using chemical weapons in Syria? So this week we've had unconfirmed reports, and that has to be emphasised, that chemical weapons may have been used in Syria. There's a good likelihood they have, though. The timing of this, Craig, is key. And there's two aspects of the timing. First, it coincides with Cyprus, and that's significant of itself, right? Yes. It's whenever there's a sort of a break in the financial system, you've got, because we know there's a faction in London that would be prepared to blow up the world in order to avoid, to head off any kind of Glass-Steagall solution, because that would take away their power. Yes. And they've been pushing for a world war, and we've been exposing that for a long time. So this Cyprus thing is no small potatoes, and that happens in the context of that. The other timing issue is Obama in Israel, because that's right next door to Syria effectively, right? Mm-hmm. Last year, Obama said, because you know that when they intervened in Libya and toppled Gaddafi, Syria was supposed to be next straight away, and it's been held up. We've been part of the general opposition around the world to this regime change, nutty policy
not
coming
Australia,
out of the US.
Our organisation.
Yeah, not Australia. Australia is all for regime change. In fact, we're pushing it. So, but Obama said last year that the red line, that the excuse he would use to intervene would be chemical weapons, right? So you've got, it's now happened. The head of NATO was testifying before the US Congress this week, saying, he said, NATO is prepared to intervene, we're ready to go. And he was open, intervene to topple Assad. You know, they're not trying to be balanced on one side or the other. No, we're going to topple this guy. Here's the biggest problem. Assad likely didn't do it. It would make no sense for him to do it anyway, but even the anti-Assad media, Craig, admit that they couldn't rule out it's the rebels that have used these chemical weapons. Assad has called in the UN to investigate who did it and how. Russia definitely believes that it was the rebels who did it. So the Russian Foreign Ministry said this week, quote, "We are extremely worried over the fact that armed militants have laid hands on WMDs, which still worsens the situation in Syria and propels confrontation in that country into a new spiral," end quote. So, Craig, if Obama uses these chemical weapons as the excuse to intervene under the doctrine of, you know, responsibility to protect, with Tony Blair and Gareth Evans' doctrine, we talked about Evans on this last week, Russia is not going to sit idly by, is it?
No, because Russia has very close, I think, treaty arrangements with Syria. It has a port there that it docks its own vessels at. It has a very close alliance. But more importantly, Russia understands this principle of sovereignty. And that what they're watching in Syria is the destruction of the national sovereignty of a nation. This has got nothing to do with whether the leader is a tyrant or whatever. It has got to do with the question of the actual sovereignty of the peoples themselves. And the argument is that, you know, the right to protect, or the responsibility to protect, is that there's some atrocity being done by the leader, therefore you go and you take it over, you make it a protectorate of external powers. Now, this is what's up for grabs here. This principle of sovereignty is what the Russians see as the principle that's being violated, and they see that as the principle that is going to be used, you know, the same principle to violate them, to overthrow them. Same with China. So the issue is not just about Syria, it's about this principle of national sovereignty, and that's what the Russians are reacting to. They're not going to allow this to happen.
And so as of this event, because it's probably entirely staged, we've taken a step closer to the possibility of a world war.
And that's the problem, is because, you know, this principle is so dear to the Russians that they won't see it violated.
Yep. All right. We have to leave it there for this week's CEC Report. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more.